Hello everyone, today we look a bit more in depth Ukrainian policy in Galicia around the year 1900. As we have seen yesterday, Habsburgic Galicia was essentially the cradle of the making properly of a modern national Ukrainian identity based on properly democratic principles and statal aspirations, and was, let's say, interestingly complicated by the various factions and views and even properly cultural constructions that were being enhanced not just by Ukrainians there, but in part by the same Polish officials that fundamentally were in charge of the land. Even in the eastern part, that was prevalently Ukrainian as opposed to the western, that included also Krakow, and was majority Polish altogether. And also this look at the Ukrainians living in the Russian Empire next door in the east, that were in contact, of course, with the Galician Ukrainians and would, in fact, greatly influence this and catalyze this process of national formation. So when we look at in the previous video, we've seen fundamentally how there were two parties, let's say, the names of which can be a bit misleading if one doesn't contextualize them. That is, let's say, the Russophile and the Ukrainophile one. Now, within the same Ukrainian, in fact, national movement, that is to say, the Russophilic one was not much in favor of any Russian government, for that matter, but simply referring to the fact that there were Ukrainians within the Russian Empire, right? And so what they were talking about, given that the Galicians were under the Habsburgs, of course, was that the prevalent models that would have been hopefully employed for this process of Ukrainian properly struggle for independence would have had to be drawn from the east, right, from those lands that had civilized, the Ukrainian lands that had civilized culturally, the same Muscovy, over the centuries, that had maintained an important cultural level, right, in places like Kiev, Kharkov, and so on, and that, in theory, yes, looked also at a possible Tsarist, influence, right, in the area because of the attritions existing between the Habsburgs and the Tsars, but not really because they wanted to be under either of them, right, but just because of becoming independent. In fact, this concept of Russophilia was mostly connected to a culture that looked at, say, at the basics of what the basis had been of the old Rus, right, and of the Ruthenian culture that had maintained this primacy in Eastern Europe, culturally speaking, and so the both sides, let's say, the Ukrainophiles in this sense were instead those that in Galicia saw properly the majority of local Ukrainians to be really the center of the Ukrainian independence struggle, also as in respects to the ones living in the Tsarist lands, seeked a national unity between the two, right? There was no, it was just an orientation within the same, and mostly Galician, in fact, Ukrainian political, political choices, political sides, right? And so it didn't really have much, actually, of a broader international point. It was rather saying, two different sides within the same Galician Ukrainians in a way that was also relatively self-referential to them. So the Russophiles used this bizarre mixture of Galician dialects, Church Slavonic, and elements of literary Russian as the linguistic point of reference. The Ukrainophiles instead would simply use the Galician dialect as the Ukrainian language. This is a debate that was going on at the same time, by the way, many other countries that were seeking for independence, demanding which cultural reference should be even just linguistically, right? Just think about the German or the Italian unification, or thinking even within the same Poland that was intertwined with Ukrainian affairs. What was the area within these countries that would have had the prevalent cultural model for the United Nation, and so on. And there is naturally there was a barrier between the Galicians and the Ukrainians living under the Tsars, so that there wasn't even too much knowledge at a popular level of what was really from the other side, right? Nor the people or the masses really looked at this linguistic issues as the most central one. But this was very important eventually for the state that would have come at some point. And so for the elites and those who were catalyzing the process of emancipation and independence to rule, to have an administration, some uniform educational system, and so on. And there was a general ambition, of course, to extend both this point of view eventually to the whole mass of unified Ukrainians across the two empires. And the support of the population was important because the at least on paper numbers counted. They counted as much as democratization process, also the schooling process that was going on, especially in fact in the Habsburgic lands, that was bringing more and more people to the awareness of their, in fact, national identity and what this entailed from a political point of view. So winning the masses, aside also from the linguistic problem, but mostly from a social point of view, was particularly important. And there was a general orientation among the Ukrainophiles towards the model that other Slavic nationalities under Habsburgic rule had employed for in the independent movements. There was a similarity, for example, with Bohemia, as the Czechs at that point were dreaming of, say, becoming part of the Russian Empire at the time, at least in this anti-Habsburgic fashion. So you understand how contingental it was. Of course, the Czechs would have not been happy to be under Russian rule in the first place. The same goes for the Balkan nations that at that point were seeing, especially German power, in an increasing, say, properly competitive, at least, guise towards the Slavic identity. So there was a lot of pan-Slavism in general, blending in these movements, which in the Galician Ukrainian case was also kind of interesting, given that they were under, generally speaking, Polish rule, right? So at least the elite was Polish or Polonized, and so how to, as we'll see now, how to respond to that, how to rethink the idea of the Commonwealth, or in fact the United Church, and what was the previous and the future state of Ukraine under Polish domination, and so on. And especially there was an idea from the same Poles, interestingly enough, living in the Habsburgic Empire, to turn Galicia, that they inhabited, largely especially in the west, as a sort of Polish Piedmont. That is to say, to make what the Italians had done with the Kingdom of Piedmont, that had led the process of Italian unification, that at that point was fundamentally completed, also at the expense of fact of the same Habsburgic empires, as you know. Basically, this was more or less finished by 1870. Germany also had been unified the year after. So there was naturally an aspiration from the Polish element in Galicia to have a say in what would have been eventually the process of Polish reunification that, as you know, would occur only after World War I. And there was a difference between all these nations and Ukraine, though, because while Poland, Germany, Italy all had a statal tradition historically, right? Like Poland had probably had a kingdom on its own. Germany and Italy in theory also, but in practice they had been politically fragmented up to that point, but still they were some of the most historically, had pioneered for centuries this some process of state building, and they were more advanced countries in the first place, so their process of unification had gone somewhat smoothly. With Poland, however, the problem was paradoxically more complicated because the Polish kingdom had been effectively at the head of a commonwealth in practice, right? In a Central European guise. It was, let's say, different, of course, from the Habsburgic Empire, but similar, at least in the same measure in which, in fact, the Habsburgic Empire had participated to the partition of Poland, had integrated those territories also, so making of it a multicultural empire. So Ukrainians, in that sense, didn't quite have much of a previous tradition. Their country had been fundamentally incorporated in the Lithuanian under Lithuanian domination since the 13th century, 13th, 14th century. Then eventually, as we've seen in the 16th, they had passed properly under within the Polish kingdom that took all those parts of the old Rus. So there wasn't quite a settled tradition in the Ukrainian lands. And so the Ukrainian independence struggle at this point was entailing, differently from other countries that already had known states, independent statehood, the creation of something completely new, right? That in this sense helped also the process of democratization and nationalization, because it was based more properly on a popular identity, not like in the case of other countries mostly on an elite continuity. And regarding this blend of previous cultural influences and so on, the figure of Andrei Sheptyts'kyi, so as you know, the most important 20th century Ukrainian ecclesiastical figure, the metropolite of the Greek Catholic Church, is quite exemplificative, as he was Polish in origin, right? This is an evidence, of course, of the continuity in the presence of Polish culture and life that was going on effectively in Galicia, even in the areas where Ukrainian was prevalent. And this influence was important for Ukrainians because the Poles that were quite, as you know, involved themselves in their process, in fact, of national independence, in also effectively under two countries under which the same Ukrainians were, so the Habsburgs and the Romanovs dynasties, provided with the essentially the activistic models. They were seen properly as the rulers of the land, as they worked in Galicia for the Habsburgs as officials largely, thus also as rivals. But that process of hybridization that conflict brings, of course, is crucial. The Poles had an important degree of autonomy within the Habsburgic Empire, so that the Ukrainians could look at, saying to Vienna properly, look, that they have those autonomies. Here we're prevalent. We may sympathize towards, at least we may lean more towards the Russian orbit. So take into account our situation, because you may be really interested in that. And this was definitely self-evident in the measure in which the majority of local officials were Polish, a good 90%, and plus they were aristocrats. So this was in jarring contrast with not just with the majority of Ukrainians in the east, but probably also with the social divide that was present at the point. And there was also a Polish political activism. The National Democrats, as modern nationalists, were active also in Galicia to spread Polish culture in the land, and therefore Ukrainian activists were obviously drawn by these models. And there was an opposite flow as well, though, because Polish policy was not univocal in Galicia. In particular, there was a separation between the Polish aristocrats and the Polish nationalists, because naturally the elite position would have been challenged by an eventual reunification. It would have had a more democratic character. So the same Polish officials began to use the same Ukrainian movement of independence for their goal, and also consequently supporting the same. For example, in the early 90s of the 19th century, the Polish officials in Galicia that were practically Habsburgic servants generally favored the Ukrainophile and mostly probably Galician party over the Russophile orientation that would have looked at importing models from Ukrainians living in the Russian Empire. And there was, in fact, even a committee composed by Polish noblemen that at some point decided to standardize Ukrainian language according to the Ukrainian vernacular orthography, rather than the models as we've seen that surely inventive melange that the Russophiles had come up with. And this was in part obvious, considering that the local Polish elite was kind of simply more sympathetic towards the local Ukrainians, that some living under the Tsars, and generally speaking, so they thought they could make leverage within the same Habsburgic Empire was a better option, let's say, than the Tsarist one at that point, against which, in fact, most of the Polish independent movement was aimed at that point, given that most of Poland was under the Russians rather than Prussia or Austria. And there were also important Polish influences in the major educational centers. For example, talking about gentry normally, Mikhailo Hrushevs'kyi, right? He was a professor, historian, owning a chair of Eastern European history at the University of Lviv. And he, as we've seen in previous videos, was actually a former Russian subject that had escaped from Kiev, if I'm not wrong specifically. He lived between 1866 and 1934. And as we've seen in Kiev was traditionally at that point, culturally speaking, a Polish city, right? As we've seen in the right bank and left bank, Ukraine under the Tsars, generally speaking, the Ukrainians had maintained a Polish or Polonized elite that was importantly proud and aware of the importance of Polish culture that had largely, together with the Ukrainian one, been constituted this blend that had somewhat acculturated the same Muscovy back in the day. So there was a different relation between Polish and Ukrainian culture in the Russian lands than compared to Galicia, where the relation was more oppositional. And there was, in fact, a broader effort from the Austrians and the Austrian Poles to maintain a stronger connection between Lviv and Kiev, right? Or Lvov, Lemberg, Lviv, and Kiev, Kiev and Kiev. So in Kiev especially, the main problem was Russian censorship that, as we've seen in previous videos, had properly denied the existence, the historical existence of any Ukrainian culture, practically. And so this would create an obvious contrast that the local Ukrainians were were trying to compensate also by searching for support towards a broader West. So in this sense, Polish culture served as a form of resistance. It wasn't seen oppositionally. So much that Hrushevs'kyi, who had studied under Volodymyr Antonovich, who was a Ukrainian historian of Polish origins in Kiev, was surprised very much when going to Lviv, to Galicia, to find that the Poles were hostile generally to the Ukrainian cause. At least, they were more sympathetic to their role in that conflict, to maintain their privilege under the Habsburgic Empire. And Hrushevsky's work was particularly important for the construction of a Ukrainian identity through historiography, properly. He arrived in Lviv from Kiev in 1894. He immediately gave support to the Ukrainophile orientation in Galicia, providing it through a massive intellectual work. And so, especially giving a mantle of scholarship and enlightenment to not just to Ukrainian language per se, as a historiographical one, but also properly historiographically to the national idea of Ukraine. And in fact, he wrote this great work, The History of Ukraine-Rus, which introduced an important narrative historically regarding the connection between Ukraine and the Kievan Rus. And there was a markedly popular connection in the concept. It was quite intelligent, if you think about that, because in one way there was practically no empire that could claim prerogatives over Ukraine. At the same time, it bypassed what was the main narrative through the continuity of a ruling class or elite, right, between some time in the past and the modern country. And this concept was not even devoid properly of historical substance, because, as we've seen, culturally speaking, what we see as the lands of the old Rus, the most advanced, the most civilized, the ones that had in fact acculturated Lithuania first and Muscovy later, and that had kept speaking fundamentally Ruthenian, Ukrainian, were the same ones now that were looking at independence and recognizing, in a way, rediscovering their own identity in function of such multi-secular continuity. And this work was ever more remarkable if you think, after all, that Hrushevs'kyi was just come to Galicia, and yet he managed to score this hit by providing kind of the perfect narrative for Ukrainian national history. By the way, it was also entailing by this cultural continuity that fundamentally, even though the Ruthenian, the Ukrainian lands had fell under the Polish Commonwealth historically, this hadn't properly erased, in fact, on a popular base, the existence of a Ukrainian identity or culture. And that thus, there could be also a constructive idea of what not just the Commonwealth had been, but also what properly the role of Ukrainians within the same was, which was a very modern thought, after all. And there were, exactly in those years, especially with the Russian imperial census published in 1897, ever greater ideas circulating properly about what was the demographic power of the Ukrainian people, right? And as we have seen for the independence struggle and for the one of representation, etc., the popular element, the idea that Ukraine was a country of people, of peasant, right? Not of elite, of aristocrats, right? At least overwhelmingly so, was indeed the card to play, because that was literally the strength that they had at the time. In a world that was, even though gradually, especially in these Eastern European lands, democratizing, modernizing, and so on, that the protagonists of the of history would have been the people. And so stressing, let's say, an elite continuity or all these things was, say, not necessarily anachronistic, especially in those places of Europe, but in a way against at least properly the concept of democratic representation and what was overwhelmingly the majority of the people about, not just culturally or linguistically, but also socially, right? So, as we'll see now, this provided Ukraine with both a national and a social political idea that could even come together different political orientations, such as literally nationalism and socialism at the same time, which, however, were still to be considered in not much in their absolutes, but in the, as we'll see today, mostly the Galician political contingency. And as we have seen in the previous videos, the Habsburgs had, generally speaking, backed, of course, the Ukrainophile orientation over the Russophile one, for obvious reasons. So to, generally speaking, predispose Ukrainians better towards the option of remaining, if they had to choose at least temporarily between the two, to remain most from the Habsburg side of the story. And indeed, Tsarist repression was helping in that as well. But given what would have come in some, let's say, in a generation, and properly with the war, the ratios of strengths of the two powers were also a big deal, and we know in fact how where Ukraine would fall historically after that. So there was, however, some Ukrainian discontent regarding Habsburgic government in general, not just because of the aforementioned, let's say, prevalence of Polish officials in the Habsburgic administration on local base, but also because of the active manipulations that Vienna had made in the especially in the elections of 1895, 1897, right? And so this contributed to fuel Ukrainian national sentiment, properly by acknowledging, you see, that the Austrians were brought to that point because, of course, the empire was in crisis, as you know, at the time. So the Habsburgs were doing what they could to keep together this enormous, as multicultural empire that, in many ways, was becoming anachronistic, at least to the political models that after that point had been enhanced, because legitimately you can't keep that together without some increased authoritarianism. On the other hand, the Habsburgic Empire had a traditionally federalist mindset, at least that derived properly from the fact that at least the Austrians were part of a federative empire, at least they had been up to the beginning of the 19th century, but still that was the broader Middle European center and feeling. So there would have been room for autonomy. It's just like the Hungarians had, obtained them, but also with ferocious repression and towards other minorities that they hoped to control, and so on. So the situation was not easy at all. So Ukrainians, in any case, exploited this to strengthen their own point, and always looking again at the Polish model, because the Polish officials had the power, and they also were providing for those nationalistic ideas that were addressing the masses, which Ukraine, especially, the in Eastern Galicia, Ukrainians could most evidently employ at that point because of sheer demographics. And thus, there was also a general overlapping between some Polish achievements in Galicia and the ones of Ukrainian activists, right? Mostly on a nationalistic ground. And what Ukrainians were asking at that point was mostly a separation of Western and Eastern Galicia along that evident cultural divide. The West was prevalently Polish, while the East was prevalently Ukrainian. Also, the Polish part was somewhat more composed. Both sides were a considerable Jewish minority. In the Polish part were also other Eastern Slavs and Germans as well. Whereas Eastern Galicia was more evidently Ukrainian on its own. And with also a substantial Polish minority, as we've seen previously. And Ukrainians were also requiring Vienna proportional representation alongside this division in the parliament, both in Galicia and in Austria, as well as the Ukrainization of the Lvov University, that was the most prestigious cultural center in the land, as we've seen, thus somewhat qualifying and formalizing the recognition of a homogeneous Ukrainian identity in the area, just properly from a political institutional point of view. And naturally, all this was aiming more generally at the establishment of literally a Ukrainian state within ethnic borders. This is particularly important if you think about the fact it was being gestated within Habsburgic rule, as we have seen in the previous video, so that there was a room for legitimization of such independence struggle properly from Vienna. Naturally, the latter demand was much more ambitious, generally speaking. It was somewhat an obvious consequence in line of principle, but naturally was a big deal. And it was being, at this point, pushed also by the Greek Catholic clergy, that, as in the previous video we have seen, was historically mostly made of essentially people of Polish descent, right? Normally, it was normal that the priest was Polish or Polonized, and the faithful of the parish were Ukrainians, right? It was the segmentation. But given the broader process of schooling, of acculturation that had been pioneered by Maria Theresia, by Joseph II, but especially later on, when after the 1848 revolution, the peasantry had been emancipated, the serfs had been emancipated, and so the peasantry had been increasingly been educated. What you had now was the appearance of a Ukrainian prevalence among the priesthood. So we're talking about literally the descendants of even of the same peasantry at that point historically. So the important process of democratization was diluting the Polish element in the Greek Catholic, that is the old Uniate Church, that had represented historically, let's say, a continuity from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but also within it properly the union, in fact, of the Western Eastern Church, the Catholic one, and the Ukrainian Orthodox one. And that thus was an important symbol, also an important relic of the Commonwealth that now was becoming fully like a Ukrainian institution, and also a tool, in fact, for the further democratization and independence struggle. And so before we were noticing how Andrzej Sheptyts'kyi represented somewhat the continuity of the old Polish gentry in the Greek Catholic clergy. But there was, of course, also this other mass shift towards a more properly Ukrainian educated and schooled and literate clergy, right? Meant that not just they knew how to read, but they had been taught properly in schools that were taught in Ukrainian. And a similar process was in fact occurring within properly the broader culture and political activism. There is a name, especially that is the one of the poet Ivan Franko, 1856-1916, that represents importantly for those lands and times properly a Ukrainian secular intelligentsia, and one that properly was active on Ukrainian soil, right? Not and say free to do so, right? As we've seen in the Tsarist lands, this was fundamentally more difficult, and there were many exiles, and there were also many movements, let's say, among Poles, Lithuanians, etc., Ukrainians, in a broader international culture that surely helped them to let's say, in fact, to be more aware, to open more to the broader Western politics and other countries' nationalities' struggles for independence. But what is important of Galicia, again, is the fact that this Ukrainization was taking place autonomously and successfully, and was fundamentally accepted by the institutions. So much that the local ones were becoming Ukrainian properly themselves. And even Franco is particular in this context, because he was not really a true Ukrainian, nationally speaking, at least from a cultural point of view, because his father was a village blacksmith of German origins. His mother was of Polish gentry, essentially. So nothing special from a social point of view, in fact, but still above average and still essentially of German-Polish descent. In 1864, he was sent to study in a German school of the Basilians that were still, however, part of the Greek Catholic Church, were properly an order within it, that was particularly concerned about maintaining the cultural, educational connection with the properly with the Latin West mostly and properly. So beyond actually what was the traditional scope of the Greek Catholic one in Galicia, and he was opened in this education to Polish culture, Russian politics, and other European ideologies of the end of the 19th century. He was one of those who met with this international intelligentsia. For example, in 1876 he met with the historian Mikhailo Drahomanov, 1841-95, that was a Ukrainian exile from the Russian Empire, he had lost specifically his professorship in Kiev, so he was part of the Tsarist censorship victims, let's say. Drahomanov encouraged Franco and other intellectuals like him that their general sympathy, in this case towards the Ukrainian culture in Russia, should be properly sublimated into brotherhood with the Ukrainian people. And in the 80s of the 19th century, thanks to a public trial in writings in Polish, Franco became also a famous socialist in Lvov. So much that in 1890 he co-founded a peasant radical party that was essentially working for the socialist spread, let's say, in Galicia, for also the political split into the eastern, in fact, Ukrainian and Western Polish respective districts, right? And he was provocative because he wouldn't seek compromises with those who would oppose this, because as he wrote, for example, in German at some point, which was a way to properly go against the Polish ideal, but he wrote in Polish too, right? So to also provoke in part the same Ukrainian policy. And he became a protege of the same Hrushevs'kyi, who had stressed the importance of a popular narrative, populistic too, in the reconstruction of Ukrainian historical identity in his historian's work. And on Christmas Eve 1899, the two men met with and other leaders of the National Party, published an appeal to all classes of Ukrainian society for the general endeavor of national sovereignty. Bear it in mind. So here there is a national perspective and a social perspective at the same point. It was all across the spectrum, right? It was properly a Ukrainian mobilization it was called for. And naturally there were debates on how this should have been achieved, like it was not a universal consensus. For example, Franco continued to believe that an elite had to manage the whole political process, but the concept of elite itself had changed now historically in this Galician Ukrainian reality. And there was, if anything, a consensus on the borders that the Ukrainian people occupied ethnographically, let's say. And what is fascinating, as you have understood, if maybe was confused, that the national activists in Galician Ukraine had been socialist in their youth, at least. And this is interesting because it's also connected with the Polish experience, and also with the one of other, most of European countries in the day. Right here, naturally, as you know, I'm not sympathetic of socialism in general, but we're talking about times and places where, of course, the idea that the peasantry had somewhat to gain more rights, properly representatively, democratically, was a big deal in Eastern Europe, where the tradition was essentially just enormously powerful landowners, latifundia, and so, generally speaking, an oppressive, stagnant situation, right? So as always with these movements, it's not that as always the ideologues are in the elite, right? And the mass of the people just doesn't quite get or understand, right? The important is to move them. But here, so we were talking about, politically speaking, in a socialistic sense, so we don't have to imagine necessarily here all socialist committees everywhere. This was a broader tool, as we've seen, that would bring actually these meant being nationalists at the end of the day, not socialists per se, and therefore all the thing was blended with in the cause properly of Ukrainian independence and the improving of the living condition of the people altogether that were overwhelmingly peasants, right? And so it was relatively common also in the rest of Europe at the time. And Poland, we just mentioned an example. If you look at the founders of the Polish national democracy, being socialists like Roman Dmowski, the youth organizer Zygmunt Baryszki, social theorist Stanisław Grabski, those had all been socialists when they were young. So there is really no contradiction, right? It's very, I know that we don't talk much about modern politics and political ideologies. I think that the newer generations, especially those born, let's say in the late 90s, from the early 2000s, literally haven't the palest idea of what the hell any, political ideology actually meant. First of all, in theory, then even less of how this was applied in practice, historically, right? So labeling things, starting from those bullshit of critical race theory or gender theory, whatever, has become the easy way of the severely undereducated to pretend that, if you stamp one level on somebody, that's it, right? It's done, right? That's essentially all the mental backwardness and laziness and incapacity and illiteracy that and moral inexistence that we're seeing today. So in order to understand this, I say it because, again, I don't like socialism at all, and nor Ukrainians would like the Soviet Union or else. But the question in general is that socialists at the beginning of the 19th century, of the 20th century, in a country like in Eastern Europe in general, was something that today we don't even understand in terms of what it means not to live in misery, right, and to seek for better living conditions and so on. And this aspect here is fascinating because the same historical reality, as always, explains better than anything else what this meant. There was no contradiction between socialism and nationalism for what was being tried in Ukraine at the time. Every mean was useful to seek independence, and what truly matters is properly the national identity that was really being kept, was being prevented from breaking free, and that was mounting up, however, its strength for achieving that. So paradoxically, Ukrainians, it's not that they really cared about socialism or nationalism per se. Literally, their main goal in their horizon, in their mind, was the divide with the Poles. That was the only true difference, say, that they saw. Look at the Poles, what status they have in general here in Galicia. We must be like them, right? We must compete with them. And so we will use whatever they're using there. What are the Poles doing? Nationalism, okay, take it. Socialism, okay, take it. This was the logic behind it, right? And it's crucial to understand. Ukrainians influenced by Drahomanov believed that, for example, Ukrainian socialism would of course arise from Ukrainian people, Polish socialism from Polish people, and so on. So in this concept, what matters is not much socialism, but the fact it was the awareness of a Ukrainian people, right? And I care to stress this because you understand that the series I'm making here is aimed at properly showing historically the existence of the Ukrainian people and national identity that in many ways have nothing to do with whether an independent country existed or not. Right, and this, in the case of Ukraine, is, as we were saying before, compared just to countries like Poland or Germany or Italy, etc., is is very meaningful, right? Because also those countries had never been unified at one point, but they already had a national culture. And it doesn't matter how much this gets eventually engineered, but these are topics we discussed even when we talk about medieval history and let's say the crisis of universalism, the rise of national monarchies, and so these kind of broader national identities that, of course, were worked out throughout, together with lots of other things that were going on in the meanwhile, right? And so, but they existed, right? And they cannot be denied, they cannot be ignored. And especially in the case of Ukraine, I think in these times it's even more important, because it's the symbol of a country that exists and resists even without fundamentally a long statal or independent tradition. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all, as you're seeing. So the masses were crucial in this process. Even for the same economy, for the same, we've seen it even today. Look at the price of grain, right? You can't really act as if, still what we've been doing for millennia in terms of primary production didn't count even today. So Ukraine is still this major granary, and at the time, the peasantry, that's what they were. So it was unavoidable to conceive that, of course, if we're looking at this struggle both from a national or social point of view, that it would be the Ukrainian mass to lead a revolution, as a Polish mass in Poland would do the revolution, and so on, against the foreign government. Thus, the overlapping of the Ukrainian revolution and ethnicity was secured in such situation. As we were saying before, the 1897 Russian imperial census had properly laid out what the ethnic map of Tsarist Ukraine was for the Galician Ukrainians to be aware of, even across the border, how many connationals could be mobilized in the case of insurrection. And this of course was a warning to other nationalities, including the Polish one, given that many Polish nationalists were, close at this point to the idea properly of revolution, of struggle for national independence, and thus seeking to reestablish the old Commonwealth, in which, of course, Ukrainian lands would have been ideally to be reintegrated from their own point of view. So the Ukrainian demographics there was just a powerful mean of, also of deterrence and of also strengthening of self-confidence for the same people. And given that the years we're talking about are more or less all these ones around the year 1900, it's important to stress that all these secular political ideals were happening in contemporary to essentially the transformation of the Greek Catholic Church by work of the Metropolitan Andrei Sheptyts'kyi into a democratic instrument of Ukrainian national revival, right? And generally overlapping with the same social and linguistic instances that were one at this point with the religious one. And thus, it's fair to say that paradoxically, and that's how strong Ukrainian national identity was, that both radicals and churchmen would stand together with basically all the rest of the political and social spectrum, right, for supporting the cause, right? Naturally, now this had historical implications, such as, for example, in the Commonwealth, as we've seen in the previous centuries. Of course, times had changed, but the peasantry didn't have any part in it fundamentally. So now, showing this dramatic Ukrainian compaction in the range of the millions was just a way of saying things will never be like before again. And thus there were naturally many ideas at this point fueling like kind of resentment towards the Poles in general, that were pictured as exploiters and aliens to Ukrainian reality. And the same fact that the Greek Catholic Church was operating in this Ukrainian national direction was even more powerful because, as we've seen, the United Church was nothing but essentially a survival of the early modern Commonwealth. So the fact that this had become Ukrainian completely was also a major achievement, not just change, because this was seen by Ukrainians as a victory. The same religious divide was widened. I mean, Roman Catholicism now began to be properly pertaining to the Polish nationality, right? Whereas Orthodoxy to the Ukrainians. The same goes for language. As we've seen in previous videos, there is no doubt that Polish had a dramatic importance in the development of a Ukrainian literature, but now the Ukrainian national language was increasingly being seen as the codified vernacular. And thus that Polish properly was not used anymore, right? At least it was now seen just as one of the other languages after Ukrainian in importance in Galicia, but it had fundamentally lost that primacy that had maintained historically in the previous centuries. And yeah, so for today we stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. See you next time.